But yeah, a bit of housekeeping out of the way. Thank you so much for joining us. We're doing these webinars to kind of take the place of the first few winter series races of the year, and keeping an eye on all the regulations and rules and seeing what we can do over the next few weeks in that space as well, which is exciting. So today we've very kindly been joined with three of our very, very knowledgeable sailors and members and people that put a lot back into the club. We've got Rick Longbottom, John Whitfield and Paddy Hodgman joining us for a chat about rules and protests. So I'll hand over to them now. I'll try not to do too much more talking because we've already got three people to do the talking here, but I'll be doing some filming and stuff in the background. Thanks, guys.
Right, just among the three of us, John.
Paddy, you have muted there, mate.
John is acting as a sort of moderator, chair, and will provide input throughout. Rick's going to open fire with a coverage of some scenarios and some particular transition from one rule to another, and also talk about some of the resources available for on rules. I'll then follow in on three issues, which are primarily avoiding contact, keeping clear, and room. We will then move into a slightly more collective session on the arbitration and protest process, which John will lead, but we'll all take a slice of. And there will be time for questions and answers, both on completion, but also if you've got a burning issue, stick your hand up, and we'll try and do it on the fly or hold it over if we have to. I'll hand it on to Rick.
Thanks, Paddy. What we're going to sort of run through here is just some basic things, and what I've learned in the last few years whilst I've been the ACT rep on the Racing Rules Committee and National Racing Officials Committee is that there are real experts in this field, and I'm not one of them. So I think we're all very much in the same situation, that we might know some of the rules, we might know some of the scenarios in which those rules are applicable, but I'll guarantee we can't do it confidently every time in every scenario that we see. So to help us get through some of those matters, our plan is to run, hopefully if Steve's ready to roll with it, a little video, which is an animation. And it's just one example of the sort of things that we can all make use of. And there are multiple sources of these, and some of them are getting better and better. This one here is just a simple animation about approaching a windward mark, and a pretty common problem for many of us, whether in a small fleet or a big fleet. Surprisingly, you only need to have 2 boats to cause a problem in this scenario. And whilst some people arrive at this mark with more than 2, it's just about the problem of tacking in the zone. And I think we'll find that in this animation, the zone mark is marked for our benefit. But if you can repeatedly and confidently identify where that ring is, that circle that you'll see on the animation, best of luck if you go to a practice room and try to convince somebody that you were inside or outside that circle when you tacked. In this situation, the red boat because they're likely to get pinged for being in the wrong here, and that's simply that the boat astern was forced to luff. In the next incident here, the boat tacks, and the boat coming in behind has a choice of dipping in and establishing an overlap, at which point the green boat is allowed to luff to clear the mark. Once again, the red boat's in trouble. Here's a solution for this that works in most circumstances. You're crossing, just take it a little bit further. You might lose that one boat at the mark, but you'll certainly gain time by not being in a protest room. You'll certainly gain time by getting onto the run perhaps a little higher than that boat. That might well prove to be an equaliser anyway, and it's the low risk solution in this situation. Many people try their luck. They think that they can bluff through this. That determination of a 3 boat length at waterline level, depending if you're in a dinghy or even in a yacht, is very hard. And it gets even more complicated when you have a mixed fleet like we have in Canberra. And you're talking about the 3 circle length based on the largest yacht. So think again and think whether caution is the appropriate line to take. Now, this animation is one of many that is available online. We have some other really useful tools available to us. And what we're going to run through with a bit of help from Steve is a couple of casebook examples. You would all be aware that the racing rules of sailing are available online. There's also a couple of resources there that are the casebooks, and they are a series of evolutions which the World Sailing have considered a good exemplars of how the rules should be applied and interpreted. In some cases, they are simply reinforcing a rule outcome based on an interesting scenario. And other times it relates to an appeal where a local protest committee has passed sentence on an incident. Somebody has felt uncomfortable with the outcome and it's gone to an appeal. And in some cases, the original interpretation is ratified. In other cases, it's overturned. So, as I said at my start, not all of us are absolutely across all of these issues. Protest committees can make mistakes in their interpretations or on the facts found as they see them. And there is a process in the main, unless appeals are not allowed due to an international jury or an appropriately constituted national jury being put in place. There's an opportunity to learn, is all I'd say. And if you choose to go to a protest room, it's not always a guaranteed outcome that you'll come out, I guess, as many people find in the courts of law. So, Steve, you might help me here with just going to do an image of one of the cases to start with in the casebook. And there are a number of these. When we have a look at them, is that up, Steve?
Yes, so I'll just get you my camera.
Okay. So what we're going to show you here is a couple of casebook examples. This one is case 6. In the casebook, they're not in sequential order. So to find this one, you'll find it somewhere down through the mass of the book. But it's a simple one of approaching, it may well be approaching a mark, but it could just be a crossing scenario. And many of you have probably been in a situation where, as a starboard tack boat approaching, you start to alter course to avoid them, and then they tack. This often causes a level of frustration and sometimes quite aggressive behaviour by some port tackers who think they're being balked, but it's an entitlement of the starboard tack boat they can tack. And one of the questions here would be, what can you do about it? My main view here would be that in this situation, be ready to change course, but don't always change course early. Change course as late as you're comfortable in the conditions to do so. And if the starboard tacker does do a leave out tack on you, be prepared for that. Often tacking away is not necessarily the right idea, but you can also be ready to luff again and maintain height. If you're approaching a windward mark, you might choose to hold that boat out to the starboard tack ley line and turn a semi-aggressive move on their part to one of entrapment. But don't be flustered, because in most of these scenarios, people are doing these things for a reason, and your challenge is not to be seduced into their trap, but manage it to your own advantage. So stay cool. The next case we're going to have a look at is case 7.
Just try and move.
Right, we're on case 7 here. And this one, if you look at the start of the case, it's got the multitude of rules that are applicable. And this is something I find really, really useful with casebook solutions. It runs you through a sequence of rules and where they transition. Now, the aim is not necessarily to run through this in great detail, but we move across to the visual image And the benefit of some of these cases is that we do get a step-by-step transition. And in this situation, a boat travelling slightly faster from the stern can gain an overlap, at which point they have no particular rights. But after a period of time, they do acquire rights. There's limitations to those rights, obviously. But in this sequence, when you read through it, and I don't expect you to sort of pick it up straight away, but I'm just giving this as a referral to one you might want to have a think about. This happens quite regularly in mixed fleet racing, whereby a boat coming from the stern has no rights. The boat that's being overtaken might persist with the view that that boat has no rights, but that doesn't last the whole way through. So keep that in mind when you've got faster moving boats around you. You might start off in a position of some strength. What you don't see at the moment yet is what happens as you approach the mark. And once again, there's some transitions that occur at the three-boat length circle when you get to a mark rounding scenario. So that's another example of a well-described and visual case. Case 9 is one of proper course. This sometimes occurs also, especially when you have multiple windward marks, or a scenario where somebody's proper course isn't the same as your proper course. There's no obligation for boats to actually go around a mark, and this is often used tactically by boats seeking to hold off on going around a starboard tack rounding to force a boat off the course further. The trap here is that they're trying to force the port boat to tack away and do a double tack effectively, which will generate a bit of distance around the windward mark for them and a bit of space for the run. Pretty important for asymmetrics and kite-based boats, less so for cat rigged and the like. But in this scenario, you have only got a couple of options if you're the port tack boat, and that would be to slow down. Of course, the other boat, they may slow down as well, and I'm sure Paddy will probably come into some of this with team racing tactics. But try to get around the stern and not be forced to do a double tack. Not easy, takes a bit of good boat control to be able to do this, and it depends how much room that starboard tacker has left for a port tacker to get through the mark, perhaps with a luff, as long as they maintain some speed.
Perfect. And we just had a question from Julian about this casebook. It is available online from the World Sailing website. A quick Google will get you there, but I will paste the link into the chat when I get a second. So we're dealing with two physical books down here today. One of those is the ISAF casebook, which gives us some really good practical examples, but is referring back to, not the power cord, it's referring back to the racing rules of sailing. Both of these are available online, but the club does have a couple of copies if you would like to borrow them, sanitize them and peruse them.
The final case that I was going to run through is case 11, and it's a pretty regular occurrence, especially when you get into tight scenarios approaching windward marks. Two port tackers come across a starboard tacker. You have a situation of who's got obligations to avoid contact and the rights and obligations of windward and leeward boats on the same tack. This one happens pretty regularly, I think you'll find, and certainly in some of the more densely packed race courses, certainly we see this a lot in lasers. And the issue here is to make calls early and make it clear what the intentions are if a boat seeks to alter course, seeks room. You have to make it fairly clear. I've seen this scenario in many cases, and one of the challenges is for the windward boat, if they have called for water or room to get astern, is to manage that approach quite carefully. Dropping sheet bearing away closes the gap between the windward and leeward boats very rapidly. They do have rights, but they should be making it quite clear. The boats also accelerate, so there's a danger of taking out the port aft corner, starboard tacker. So it's a fairly dangerous scenario at times in windy conditions, and if the leeward boat fails to respond quickly. So just be conscious of that. As I said earlier, getting yourself in a protest scenario in these situations There's never a foregone conclusion as to who is in the right, who is in the wrong. But if either of those port tack boats hits the starboard tack boat, it's pretty clear. Make sure your insurance policy is paid up. So on the basis of those cases, there are over 100, I think, in the casebook. They are replaced and refreshed periodically, but probably only every couple of years. And from a perspective of how else you might use them, I'd also recommend there's lots of other resources out there available, and there's one that's been around for more than 27 years. I think it's Dave Dellenbauer has run a series called Speed and Smarts, which people might have seen in many of the sailing magazines over the years, that often be extracts in Australian sailing and various other international publications. These days, most of those systems have stopped doing paper versions. They are online, and I've found them in years gone by really very helpful to replay scenarios that you can't always dream about. They are normally based on high propensity sort of incidents and collisions and protest hearings, and they're designed to help you pre-plan before you see these scenarios on the water. So I recommend that you have a look at some of those. And I think we've got some of the details that Steve will ping onto the website. As I say, Speed and Smarts is just one of the products that are available. There are several others put out by reputable sailors, racers, race officials, and the like. So Paddy, I think that's me for the moment. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Rick. Much of the learning I've had about how things work in the protest room has been watching guys like Rick and John here, as well as at some regattas outside of Canberra. But more of what I've seen has been through on the water umpiring, where you're making a call in real time and you can't unblow that whistle. And by and large, it reinforces what Rick was saying about none of us know it all. I reckon if we get between 75 and 80% right, that's pretty miraculously good when you're doing the live calls. But it does take your eye to look for certain things in the transactions which happen on the water and around which these rules operate. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about three things which seem to underpin a lot of what goes wrong. And the first one is the basic obligation to avoid contact. You've got in the racing rules, right up the very front, rules 10 to sort of 31 are about what you do on the water, and 10 to 13 talk about who's got right away, you know, port starboard, same tack overlapped and what have you, and who's got right away. Well, section 14 brings a moment of sanity, because as I think we all know, you can't slap your boat onto starboard under the bows of someone coming at you on port. You hear people talking about he tacked in my water or whatever, and I'll come to what the rule really is in a minute. But the bloke who's on starboard, equally, if he's steaming along on starboard and someone's a give way to him, he can't just steam on regardless. If the port tack boat piles into him, he's very likely got a problem. So you have a primary obligation to avoid contact, and it's about safety, and it's about damage to boats, and about fair competition. So there you go, you're on starboard, you see someone coming at you, you've called starboard a few times, they're not altering course. When you get to the point of realising that it might be too late to not hit him, you've got an obligation to do what you can to avoid contact. And if you don't, you'll be breaking rule 14. You'll be exonerated from that, however, if the contact does not cause damage or injury. But the basic idea is avoid contact, and you don't get a blank check if you're the right-of-way boat. There's a variety of cases on it, and if there are questions that come up, we'll probably take a look at some of those. So let's look at what happens in terms of your use of your rights. And I've pinged particularly on keeping clear and room. And you'll find that those are phrases that are used in a variety of places throughout the part 2 of the racing rules, what happens on the water stuff. You need to realise always that a lot of instances in the way the racing rules are written, the answer doesn't necessarily lie within Rule 15 or within 16. It lies equally in cross-reference. It lies in go and have a look in the definitions. And that's where I want to just turn now to talk a little bit about keeping clear. You'll be aware that there are various places where the need to, or the rights or duties of a boat to keep clear are referred to. What does it mean? Well, what it means is you are keeping clear of a right-of-way boat if that boat can sail her course with no need to take avoiding action. Again, in the on-water umpiring stuff, the number of times you'll hear protest, had to avoid. And what the bloke who believes he's the right-of-way boat is saying is that the keep clear boat didn't keep clear, I had to avoid. Don't have to wait till you've hit them. Obviously, under Rule 14, you're the right-of-way boat, you've got to avoid contact. So keeping clear is about ensuring that the right-of-way boat can sail her course with no need to keep clear. And equally, because we're not talking about actually hitting each other before you've failed to keep clear, the definition goes on to make the point that when you're in an overlap situation, the right-of-way boat needs to be able to alter course in both directions without immediately making contact. So you can't be sitting 3 inches off him. You've got to be in a situation where you have kept clear to enable him to sail his course, not to avoid, and to be able to manoeuvre within reason. It ties in quite closely with another word that you see in a number of areas up and down the part 2, the on-water rules, and that is the definition of room. And you know, that room appears in a number of contexts, but we'll start with it in the most general sense, that it's the space that a boat needs in the existing conditions, including space to comply with her obligations under the rules in Part 2 and Rule 31. 31's hitting a mark, the Part 2 rules are the on-the-water stuff, while manoeuvring promptly and in a seaman-like way. So it doesn't mean you're entitled to room to blunder around the course struggling with your sheets and things, but you are entitled to room to manoeuvre promptly. So we go and have a look in some of the rules in Part 2, the avoiding contact places, and you see things like in Rule 15, when a boat acquires right of way, i.e. you're on port and they've slapped onto starboard, they get rights as the starboard tack boat, but they are required initially to give you room to keep clear. So, as I said, if they throw themselves onto starboard across your bows and you haven't got room to keep doing what you're doing till they've completed and give you room to keep clear, then they have infringed. And either an umpire or a jury would look closely at whether you as the giveaway boat were given room to keep clear. Same thing, you're the right-of-way boat, and perhaps that means that you're the leeward boat and you're overlapped. If you want to alter course, you've got to give the keep clear boat room to keep clear. You can't just suddenly slap up into them and go, windward boat, up, up, up. If you haven't given them reasonable room to get out of your way, then again, you're liable to be held to have broken Rule 16. So in umpiring it, you'll often hear people looking at the keep clear boat and asking themselves, has he done all he can to keep clear? And if he has, and he can't, then the inference is that you as the right-of-way boat have not given them the room to keep clear that's required under Rule 16. You get into some different aspects of room under the top mark scenarios that Rick demonstrated clearly in his animation. And a couple of things about the right to room. It isn't the right to exclusive use of the lake. It's the right to room to do what you are entitled to do under the rules, or to meet your obligations under the rules. So, for example, in that top mark in the zone scenario, if you're in the zone clear ahead under Rule 18, you have a right to sail to and around the mark. You don't have a right to expect that no one else is allowed into the zone around you. You know, you've got to be mindful of all the other transactions in room at a top mark. But basically, the right to room is about the right to room as per the definition. It's not a right, it's not even a right of way. It's a right to exercise your rights and duties under the rules. So I just wanted to run through those concepts of avoiding contact, keeping clear, and room against the context of the things you've got to do to avoid contact, the ways in which you can exercise your rights and obligations for port starboard, overlaps, and while tacking. And it's an interesting small thing. I'll throw it in as almost a separate item. Rule 13 is about who's got to keep clear when you're tacking. Time and again, I've seen people call a protest because a boat, alleging a boat failed to keep clear while tacking. Why? Well, their sails were or were not filled. You need to look quite closely at the wording of that rule, and indeed there's a case on it as well. What the rule says is, after a boat passes head to wind, she shall keep clear of other boats until she is on a close hauled course. The operative point there isn't whether the sails are filled or not, but what is the heading of the hull of the boat. If it is actually on a course that can be held to be a close hauled course, then she's completed the tack, turned off Rule 13, and the keep clear obligation has turned off. So there's a certain amount of cross-reference across what's in each individual rule, what's in the definitions, and to me, those underpinning concepts of what does it mean to avoid contact, keep clear, and to give room to keep clear, or indeed room, what are your rights to room around a mark or at an obstruction. And the last of the cases Rick mentioned was about room at an obstruction. I think they're quite fundamental underpinners of how you actually sail in accordance with the rules. I haven't seen any questions pop up, and I'm quite happy to pass on now to the final area we wanted to talk about, which is, Peter's got a question, right?
Just, I guess it goes to boats with different sailing characteristics, but also the port and starboard thing. A boat on a straight out port and starboard situation, starboard is called, the port tack boat says, hold your course. And then tacks within touching distance of the starboard tack boat. Touching distance meaning just reaching out your hand and putting your hand on the leeward deck of the starboard tack boat. But also at the same time saying, up, up, up. You know, a boat that's pointing higher than the starboard tack boat expects the windward tack boat to lift higher. Presumably there's just no, my interpretation is that boat tacked in the waters of the starboard tack boat and then has no right to be calling that windward starboard tack boat up higher than it can reasonably sail.
I think that covers very precisely a couple of the very relevant scenarios. He said, hold the course. Well, fine, that doesn't relieve him as the port tack boat of an obligation to keep clear. So there we go. He starts to tack. He moves into Rule 13. This is the port tack boat. He has an obligation under Rule 13 to keep clear until his hull is on a close hauled course. In becoming the leeward boat, he then falls under Rule 15, which gives him an obligation to initially give the windward boat room to keep clear. So you'd have to ask yourself, that is, unless he acquired the right of way because of the other boat's actions, and that's not the case in the scenario you've outlined. So following on from having acquired right of way, if he's altering course up to windward, he is going to have the right to luff that boat because he hasn't acquired his overlap from clear astern to leeward. But he, again, as the leeward right-of-way boat, he has an obligation, if he alters course, to give the windward keep clear boat room to keep clear. So in your scenario, the tests are, did he keep clear while tacking? Once he had the right, did he allow room for the keep clear boat to do so? And room doesn't mean not hitting. It means that keep clear boat has got to be able to maneuver in a seaman-like way. And so if it was actually as you described, I'd probably be waving a red flag on the water. And it'd be interesting how the evidence played out in the protest room.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it's an actual situation I'm talking about. And I think I was just so shocked that I didn't think about the